Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to Learning Revolution's Microschool Summit. I'm here with Linaberger and a great opening keynote panel. Appreciate your being here. I'm going to turn off the screen share and you'll see us on your screens. Mara, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Well, this is a new venture for Steve and I. This is the first of what we hope are going to be several ongoing summits to create awareness around the microschools movement. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, what that means. But Steve challenged me, I don't know, about a couple months ago, Steve, to think about if I were to have a chance to sit down with anybody I could choose to talk about microschools, who would that be? And this panel represents some of the people that were on my list. So I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Gina Riley, who is a professor of education at Hunter College. But she is also an expert on unschooling and I believe has unschooled her own biological children, right, Gina? And I said to Gina earlier, if I could have somebody stand in my place as both professor and thinker about alternative education, Gina would be it. We are really graced to have Henry Readhead with us today. Henry is the grandson of A.S. Neal, who some of you may know, who founded Summerhill School in England 100 years ago this year. And Summerhill is still going strong. They are having a massive event in August to celebrate the school's longevity. And actually, Henry, I would say it's legacy in you. So Henry will be here to talk with us a little bit about the legacy of Summerhill and what he thinks. And we're also super blessed to have Kelly Smith, who is the founder of Prenda. And I think, Kelly, you have like 1,100 schools going now, or over 1,100 schools going now.
It depends on how you count, but there's lots.
So, in my mind, Kelly represents the sort of front edge of the movement as far as its rapid growth and acceleration. So I've got some questions. If you're out there in the audience, I want you to open up your Q&A box right now. I'm sorry, not your Q&A. Well, you could do Q&A box, but open up your chat. If you have questions at any point in time for any of the panelists, for Steve, for we want you to jump in. We want you to be part of the conversation. So I was thinking, if we assume that most of the people who are out there in viewership land, either listening live or watching the recording, some of them may not even know what a microschool is. So my first question to the panelists would be, how would you define a microschool? What is it? Anybody want to jump in? I want to see how this goes too. I don't want to call on you guys because this is a panel. If we were sitting having dinner together, you would just talk.
I feel like Gina was about to say something.
I was just going to say, when I think of microschool, I think of learning pods. And in fact, when I thought of learning pods during the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought of you, Mara. And the first person I thought of was like, oh my gosh, it's Mara. And this is exactly what Mara has said is going to happen and has happened all over the world. And here we are with more people knowing about it. So for me, a microschool is a small pod, right, of people who have gathered together and have chosen their learning experience. And it's, for me, the coolest thing.
Okay. What do you think, Henry?
Yeah, I think probably a few different things, actually. I think, first of all, the more intimate sort of learning environment is a very, very important part of it. But I think another element I would mention is sort of the small sort of intimacy of the community, the kind of the fact that you sort of get to know each other really well, and to a certain extent the relationships can be much more fruitful and much more sort of sincere and much more real. And I think that's a very powerful, a very, very important thing, specifically within education, the learning relationship to a certain extent, but actually just relationships in general.
Henry, do you think Summerhill qualifies as a microschool?
Well, I guess it possibly could do. I mean, obviously, microschools now, the modern sort of idea of microschools is that, smaller groups can be sort of creating their own school. And I guess A.S. Neal back in 1921 I don't, he would have, it would have been a very small school that he would have started then. We would have been talking about in the earlier stages, he had a classroom with between 5 and 10 pupils. And that then grew and grew and grew. But even still today, I mean, Summerhill has up to 70 or so pupils, but we don't go much more than that. That intimacy is a very important thing. So yeah, I think there's some other elements I can probably think of that relate them as well, but that's yeah.
I think we're off to a good start. So Kelly, what do you think? What's a microschool in
It's
your definition?
Yeah, it's such a funny question, Mara, because I started what I called a microschool around my kitchen table in 2018. So like you say, I'm newer to this. I mean, my story does not go back to 1921, although I have relatives who were in classrooms in 1921, but we have this educational background. At the time I looked around and we didn't invent the word, right? People were talking about microschools at the time, but it became, it was a little nebulous. And I think at the time I saw things closer to 70 or 75 kids that were being called microschools. So I actually, you can actually probably still find these like blog posts out there on the internet somewhere. I used the word nano school for a hot minute where I was like, maybe what I'm really wanting to do is smaller than that. And that 5 to 10 range is this magical thing because you can put them in a minivan or you can do them in somebody's living room, or you just have flexibility with the group size that's so powerful. So that was what I was really excited about. And I wasn't sure what to call it. We ended up opting for the word microschool, kind of fighting for it in a way and saying those other schools I think are really important too. Maybe that's a mini school, right? It's like, if you want to go down the, mini, micro, and then nano would, I don't know what that would be. My wife told me it was too nerdy of a term. So I was not allowed to use it anymore. So so I think it really has to do with, as a category, it's about the size, and echo what Gina said about the pods
I talk with my clients all the time, Kelly, about the fact that microschool is not a legal definition.
Right.
It's not, although the governor of West Virginia has actually just recognized microschools as a way that people can take their education dollars and use them. So it's interesting. It's on the map. When I came across the term, I liked it because it felt to me like the next generation of the alternative education movement. And it was a term that everybody could wrap their heads around and begin to in the languaging know exactly what they were going to get: small, personalized, intimate, community related, student driven. If you looked in Wikipedia, it would say less than 150 students. So in my mind, Henry, Summerhill School is a microschool. It's like I think of it as the grandfather of microschools, or maybe the godfather of microschools. Okay, so I have another question for you guys. And don't forget, if you're here and you have questions for Gina or Henry or Kelly, don't be afraid to put them in the chat, and Steve's going to help me monitor that. So Gina, you're the expert sort of on unschooling and more student-driven learning. And in fact, for those of you who don't know about Gina's book, she's written a book, I call it like the definitive book on the research around these alternative kinds of education, which is super useful for us who are doing this work to have a research base to stand on. Why do you think a microschool works so well based on your understanding of the research and best practices in more student-led learning?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I can say when we think about classrooms and schools and what works, what people are always saying is smaller class size, right? Students say it, teachers say it, parents say it. And then when we go toward the more alternative education realm, this is what attracts people to the alternative education realm, right? You have places, learning environments and or unschools that provide smaller class sizes, a focus on student strengths and interests, focus on intrinsic motivation, kids and teens doing what they love, relationships, all of the things we want to see in larger schools, we see in micro schools. And that's what's so interesting about the micro school movement, right? It takes the best of what people feel education in schools should be and like kind of places it in a category, which is a really beautiful thing.
I feel like you're correct as a professor of education as well. We talk so much about best practices, what works best for kids, but in practicality in our big public school systems, it's really hard to have those things in play all the time. But in microschools, and I was just out to visit one of our schools last week, it was all there and more, like things that I didn't expect, and innovation I didn't expect. And I think that that's a hallmark. So Henry, what do you think? Why do kids do so well? And they, I've read the literature about Summerhill. They do really well. These kids do as well, if not better than students in public education. Why do kids do so well? I mean, you're an example too, right? You went to Summerhill. So,
Yeah.
What is it? Why do they work?
I think I'll talk very specifically about Summerhill, really, that children, I guess because of the non-compulsion to lessons that is applied at Summerhill School, it means that children have the time to fulfill their childhood, to be children, and to do all the wonderful things that children do and need to do, and to access learning when they feel that they want to access learning. And the most important thing about that is their relationship to learning, because it means they've chosen, they're ready, they've fulfilled. And this is something that Summerhill School, as whether people know or not, but it is actually an international boarding school, but it's not all boarders. We have day pupils as well, and we have the age from 5 up to 18. Now, what this means is that the children have the time to really relax without any expectation, without any pressure, without any sort of expectations, really, to be starting to learn at a certain time, or to so what that means is that when they learn very, very quickly and very passionately, because they're ready and they've chosen the subjects that they want to learn. And so most children go to colleges and university after they leave Summerhill. And they do very, very well in their qualifications because they're ready to do it, and they've fulfilled the other part of their childhood, sort of thing, which is the fundamental aim from someone's perspective.
Excellent. So Kelly, why do you think the students that come to Prenda schools, why do they wind up doing so well?
I think it's the same, that it's really a very similar answer to what Henry's just talking about. I think there's really two ways to do it. And there's never a pure answer. I would love to say we've been pure on all of this, constantly making compromises with what the model works, what parents expect, we work in partnership with the public education system, so we have requirements there. But ultimately, the question is education a thing that happens to you, or is learning this thing you do, right? And that agency at the core of that question is so powerful. I just feel like the education community writ large, we could ask that question all day long. I think all of us intuitively would say, hey, if there's engagement, there's a decision to learn. I've seen this firsthand. I'm sure you all have too, right? And thousands of kids at this point. If a child chooses they want to learn something, there's almost nothing you can do to get in their way or stop them. In fact, all of your efforts to stop them would make them even more determined to learn the thing they want to learn. And really the opposite is true, right? If you decide you want them to learn something that they choose not to, there's almost nothing you can do to get them to. And so really we've tried to design around that question. We feel like it's much closer to possible in a smaller group than a larger group. It's much closer to possible if you design around agency. So, an example of this is, simple ones are, we want kids reading, and the kid chooses the book instead of us choosing the book. I mean, some of these things that seem trivial or obvious, but in most classrooms, it's the unit is on this book, everyone needs to read the same book. And so you're left with a lot of kids deciding, I'm going to do the minimum amount of work to get through this unit, whatever that looks like. And that's very different than learning.
So it's kids do well because it's small class size, it's self-directed, they have agency over the choices of the things that they want to be doing. I mean, those are some of the things, and there certainly are way more of that. So I'm going to jump off my questions because now I have a sort of a corollary question that goes with this. When I was out visiting the school last week, I had this question for parents. How do you know your kid's learning? because most of our micro schools don't have grades. Now, Kelly, are your schools still assigning letter grades or giving objective assessments to check on student comprehension or learning or mastery of topics?
So we believe very strongly in giving feedback about learning, right? And showing kids exactly where they're at. We think that should be a daily thing, and it should be part of the day-to-day decision making. I think it could be heavily motivating for kids if done right. Or a letter grade, we do those too because we have to. I would say that's less exciting for us, but the goal, the sort of holy grail of this is to have this world where data is actionable, right? And that reinforces this growth mindset. Like, this is what you know right now. That has nothing to do with how valuable you are or whether you should, like the takeaway from that should always be, I want to keep trying, I want to keep learning, as opposed to, I guess I'm a C student, and like walk away with sort of giving up. So yes, we do. And we're trying to really push that envelope forward.
I want to hear both from Gina and Henry, but we've got some really good commentary going on. Steve, do you want to add anything about what you've seen coming through the chat? I mean, I know
Absolutely.
our learner liberators or folks are here with us. They've got a whole nother version of how this looks. Everybody's got a different model or idea about how it can work. But what do you want to say, Steve? What are you seeing?
Let's go down these quickly. The first is actually for me, which is the small size facilitates certain practices, but it doesn't guarantee them, right? So I'm interested if you're seeing, and you can answer this through the course of the keynote, but I'm interested if you're seeing microschools that you actually don't like the pedagogy of them, but they would qualify as a microschool just by virtue of size. And Olivia asks, question for all, mostly for Henry. What has been the government response to these alternative models and to microschooling and unschooling? Does there appear to be a change on the horizon?
Well, I would. I'm sure other people have input into this, and obviously, I'm talking from the UK. At the moment, the idea of starting schools is very, very difficult, and they put a lot of challenge into it. With homeschooling at the moment, they've been putting a lot of pressure, even with homeschooling. There are still some lovely projects around, and actually sort of learning communities, small sort of learning, sort of part-time learning communities have been happening. So often what happens in the UK is that people will be homeschooling and then will be having these sort of small part-time learning communities where then they'll be taking their children, and that kind of works in a similar kind of way to a certain extent. But it's very difficult, actually. From Summerhill's perspective, we have a lot of pressure, and we always have had. Recently, there's been a little bit of alleviation of this. In 2000, we took the government to court, and we won the court case, which was completely unique historically in the UK, which alleviated pressures for a very short period of time. But at the moment, the way things are looking, we're always on our toes, and I'm not too sure how the microschool, I've heard of, there's lots of friends of mine, lots of people I know who are starting up little projects, but normally they're learning communities that are not actually classed as schools. Yeah. Because in the UK, that puts a hell of a lot of pressure onto the establishment of what they're doing.
Yeah, well, Allison at Liberator Learners sort of referenced this too in her comment, that they don't use the word school. I mean, I'll just make clear my viewpoint, which is microschool is an umbrella term. When I work with people, they do that, what you're talking about, Henry. I think of building a school as an entrepreneurial process, mainly because I'm interested in seeing longevity. Your grandfather's school wouldn't have lasted 100 years if it didn't actually have financial legs underneath. And so I think that the really small pods, or whatever you want to call them, Gina's pods or community or whatever, is a great way to get started. And then if your governmental regulation board or whatever it is comes to challenge what you're doing, then you move into the process to become more of a formal recognized school. I mean, Kelly's model, I've read a lot into it, Kelly, but you can clarify for us, but your model has used the charter school as a legislation in Arizona and other states in the US to sit a foundation that's a little more impenetrable as far as regulation goes.
No foundation is impenetrable. Mary.
Well, I mean,
but absolutely, yeah. And really, that's two things. But the biggest one for us was actually from the market demand side of this, and it's an access question. Like I think, like a lot of people, education to me is about really providing a path for people to move and to grow and to achieve things that maybe wouldn't have been otherwise available to them. And so when we asked the question early on, do we do this as a private thing, which in Arizona and several states in the US, relatively loose, like you can, if you're doing it privately, maybe there's some paperwork you have to file, but it's not actually that hard from a regulatory perspective. That would have been easier for us, for sure. I think it would have left a lot of people out. And so we basically made that decision, said, we want to try to figure out a way that this is open to everybody without paying for it. In the US, what that means, and my neighborhood growing up, I didn't know anybody that paid for school, right? That wasn't the world that I was born into. And so wanting to really make that available to people like me and people who had a harder time than I did. And that does have costs to it. And there's things you have to learn, but it wasn't, I guess maybe as you're talking about it, Mary, it wasn't so much reaction to government kind of attacks. It was preemptive in some way. It said, hey, let's see if we can do this thing in partnership instead of challenging everything.
Yeah, I think the thing that everybody here has in common is they're looking for creative ways to create learning options for kids that are better suited to the child. Whether they're a Liberated Learners Network or Prenda or Meridian's going to be here tonight to present their model, or Acton Academy, or any of the amazing alternative education models like democratic schools or Sudbury schools or Waldorf or Montessori schools and all of that. Gina, you haven't spoken in a little bit. Do you want to weigh in on this conversation in general?
I'm just dying to address, like, are we at the tipping point yet? Right. And going back, I started homeschooling in the late 90s. And in the late 90s, like, I wouldn't let my son go out until 2:00 in the afternoon because I didn't want anyone to quote unquote report us. I live in New York State in the United States. It's a highly regulatory state. I was scared, right? I went through he probably went through his entire childhood and adolescence, and there was a lot of fear involved. Again, high regulation, right? Like, neighbors never heard of it. No one really homeschooled. And then it's so interesting, right? Like, the pandemic is not a wonderful thing. People have died and it's been horrible, but it has opened up to the general public what this idea of homeschooling or unschooling or microschooling might be and might look like. And so when we talk about the tipping point in education, Peter Gray and I will often have this conversation, right? I think we're there. I think we're finally at a point where the public understands what an unschool is, what homeschooling is, what a learning pod is. Yes, and you're fighting hard to maintain it, which is so, and this is exactly what we want to do, right? We're at the tipping point. It is very different from 20 or 30 years ago, and we want to maintain the momentum, and we want to expand the momentum. There are lots of choices in education, and I will never, as someone who educates public school teachers, I will never say something is the wrong one and something is the right one. The right one's what's right for your kids, right? So there's tons of choices, and we've just got to keep going with the fact that there are so many choices that increase engagement and increase learner intrinsic motivation and all that wonderful stuff you want to see in kids.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've got some more good questions running in or in the chat. Steve, anything that we should touch on before we jump to another question?
No, I would just encourage people to read some of the comments from Jean and from Joe that don't require an answer, but are well worth reading. Leslie says, what's the difference between a group that homeschools together and a microschool?
So you guys can vet that, but I talk about it all the time. Anybody want to do it or want me to weigh in on what I think?
I'd love to hear your answer, Mara.
So I think pods are a pandemic response. So the sort of what happened was in the summer of 2021, I'm having that COVID brain of I can't remember when during COVID, but at the beginning, Good Morning America did a story talking about pandemic pods and microschools. You know, the term microschool is, I think, 12 years old now. And you can look it up, but I think the woman's name was Kashala Berry. She wrote about them. I loved the term. I picked up the term before the pandemic. I think that they described the small school. What I think the pods was that very entry level flash innovation of, I need to get my kids together with a group of other kids for socialization to get the education work done, whether it's has been sent home or it's remote learning, and I need childcare. So parents innovated with pods, sometimes put a teacher in there, sometimes took care of the work themselves. I've had multiple calls from people who had a pod going and now want to make it something more permanent. I think that's a microschool. So that's just mainly the difference. I like to think of microschools are the next generation of schools like Henry's, you know, or many other amazing small schools that are out there. And that the term's just, it's a great marketing term that we can use to help people understand the umbrella of small schools serve a whole category of kids better than big public schools do.
Could I make the argument that there's a difference between a homeschool group and a pandemic pod, and that a homeschool group to me actually is a microschool? I would have said that they are, maybe they have different legal structures, but that they're fairly synonymous in terms of their function.
Yeah,
Disagree?
I would say, Steve, just I want to add that I personally like the term microschool, and I like for people to use that term when they're talking about a group of kids gathered for education, because I think it lets us broaden what school is and what school can be. And it lets us sort of reclaim the term from it being just a large industrial thing. So anybody else want to jump in on that?
I haven't written this down anywhere, but I've got a little spectrum in my head. So like on one end, there is that homeschool co-op, Steve, like you're talking about. And I met a lot of those people in my early research. We, interestingly, were never even homeschoolers. So my kids, I have 4 kids. They went to public schools in the neighborhood and occasionally a charter. We, you know, when we were looking at this, it was like, oh, there's all these people that are having these great experiences homeschooling, but I definitely felt the need to, one, like compensate for myself as a lacking educator, and 2, surround them with other kids in sort of an environment. And I wanted it to be a kind of a day in and day out kind of thing. So I looked into all of this, right? There was homeschool co-ops have been around forever, as you guys know. So people coming together in very ingenious ways, they're pooling resources, they're making things happen. To me, what I found was generally, and I don't want to say this is everywhere, there's this like level of commitment that was very much like, hey, it's the parent and their child is king here. And so it's, if it works for me, while it works for me, we're here, but then the next day it might not. And so there wasn't that sort of continuity for a lot of those co-ops. And you see these like turnover. It was ultimately like, the group exists to augment something that is owned by the parent and the child. And then you get to like cottage school where it kind of steps a little bit more. And then you have pods where that steps maybe a little bit more. And microschool, I think I agree with Mary on what you're saying, where it really is providing a little bit more structure. What that ultimately is doing is opening this up to a lot more parents who would say, those other things sound a little too scary for me or too open-ended. If I'm going to like pull my kid out of school, I want to have something to replace that with, at least in my head. And a microschool can do that, even if it's not all of the, you know, bells and whistles and trimmings of the, you know, the big campus, but it's like, I at least know my kid's doing English, math, social studies. There's this adult that's going to be like there for them on a regular basis. And I'm committing to the full school year with you. Like those things kind of put it in a category for a lot of parents. And that's how we've defined microschool.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of freedom on the parents' end, saying your child goes to a school. right? It provides a little bit of freedom. And that freedom is sometimes nice. There's no defensive, right? Because a lot of people have questions about homeschoolers or unschoolers, and people can get defensive, and homeschooling is a very heated term, and people assume, things about social situations and things like that. Having the option of sending your child to a microschool, whatever that looks like, does provide a lot of comfort for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Henry, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important for connecting a little bit to what Kelly was saying about the actual size, the structure, that there's actually something about the school that has a bit of something that you can hold on to a little bit. And I think that's very important actually for children. I think, yes, having a group of sort of 5 kids, 8 kids, that sort of thing. Personally, I would say that is a little bit more to the closer to the homeschooling, closer to the unschooling. It's kind of a little. It's nice, but at the same time, I think that kids, they need to have a place that is quite solid, quite firm, knows what it's doing, and actually, I think I will lay on the table, and it's always a bit of a sensitive topic, but I think it's very good for parents not to have the responsibility to be educating their children, and I think it's actually very good for a child to have the freedom to not be educated by their parents, and it doesn't mean necessarily that it can't work, but I do think that actually it's very nice for children to have the opportunity to have time where they are separated, where they're in an environment that is, obviously with all sorts of different, a lot of things we've already been speaking about, different ways of doing teacher learning environments and all the different sorts of things. But I think it's very important for them to have a sense of, I'm going to school and this is what I'm doing there, and then I'm going home. Or in our situation, they go to school for a longer period of time and then they go home for a longer period of time. And I think it's an important thing for their independence. And so I think that I would agree that whether it is or not, I think it's quite important for the terminology of microschool to actually get quite firm of what it actually is, because I think it really helps all of, as Gina was saying, it helps to give the family freedom, that they can kind of relax a bit more, understanding exactly what it is, and people can talk about it a bit more confidently. It's a school, it's what it is. And I think that is an important thing. So
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I actually agree with you. I think that and I think that there are parents who can run a microschool and do it really effectively. I've seen it done. So, I mean, I think that goes back to our discussion of just knowing your child well enough to find the environment that will actually work best for them. For some kids, that is homeschool. And I think that, when I think about microschools, I actually come at it from the lens of teacher empowerment. So I still teach at the grad school level, and I see so many teachers ready to quit the profession, so many gifted educators who, with a little bit of training in entrepreneurship and the ability to market the powerful transformation that they offer a child in language that speaks to the parent versus being educational jargon, changes the whole relationship. I had a client who described her microschool as homeschool away from school down on the farm. I mean, it was like when she said that, like that totally communicated the experience that the child was going to have. It was going to be like a homeschool experience. It was going to not be at the public school, and it was going to be on a farm. So some of it's interesting. I've gone far more down the rabbit hole of marketing, just because without the ability to communicate what the experience is going to be like. I mean, Henry, you have 100 years of legacy that Summerhill stands on. So people kind of know that. But when people are starting out with a microschool, they don't always know. People don't know what it is. It's unproven. It's a bit of an experiment to start. That actually segues really beautifully into my next question for you, which is, and Gina, you can weigh in on maybe from your children's perspective, but my question for both, it's more geared towards Henry and Kelly. What why did you build a microschool, and what were the unexpected challenges? So I know, Henry, you have to be thinking about your grandfather, but you can maybe weigh in on, why did he build Summerhill, and what were the biggest challenges he and then you and your mother face in keeping it going?
I guess what we do know from his writings is he was a teacher in another school, and it was a very, very strict school, and he had to punish children, and it was a very difficult situation. And so he, whilst in that circumstances and those pressures were being put upon him as a teacher, he was questioning himself and sort of going, why do I have the right to put my opinions as to how this child what this child should learn, or how this child should grow up. So I guess that, but in the very earlier stages, as I said, he started in a classroom in a school in Germany. That then moved to Austria. Again, he only had a classroom within a school, and then it moved to the UK in 27, and that's where it first became a school. I would say then, obviously, there's a few bits and pieces for him in his journey. The war, for example, so he had to move to a different location. He moved to Wales during that period of time. Now, I think from our perspective today, I think the amount of legislation that has been coming in for schools over the past 20 or so years, I'm not going to say that was purely negative, actually. It created a huge amount of very interesting situations for us, whilst we looked at the school and put the school down on paper, created policies around our practice and why we actually did things. So Summerhill is a very, very professional educational institute with very, very professional and experienced teachers, and we offer a huge curriculum, and it's a very important part. But to a certain extent, that has been that the being able to maintain a school that is fundamentally based on freedom and equality and community, not on lessons and learning, which generally, as soon as people put the two words together of school, and it just equals learning and education and more sort of the academic elements rather than sort of the personal development, which Summerhill focuses on. So really, I guess, maintaining the philosophy all the way through under the pressures that have been put upon the school really is what has been our challenge, I guess.
Kelly, how about you? What was your, summarize what got you to build Prenda, and what's the biggest challenge you face today, especially with like 1,100 or however many?
It's not
hundreds
that
of
many, unless you count. We have a lot of parents doing it themselves, but it is in the hundreds. Henry, were you about to say something else though? I feel like you had one more thing. No.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say that it's a struggle. We're under a struggle, but we're very used to it, and we know how to do that. We're very experienced, so that's part of how we go. But carry on, Kelly.
So you've got it. Good. We want to make sure you got it under control. That's always how we feel, right? There's things flying at you a million miles an hour, and you just kind of smile. It's like, yeah, it's going to be great. My story, Mara, is an accident, and I'll be fully open about that. Like I mentioned, I'm a father. I had a career in technology, specifically relating to helping like commercial buildings manage their greenhouse gas emissions. So had nothing to do with education, other than just being somebody interested in learning. And a father, I didn't have any right, and I started teaching kids to code at the library. So maybe, if I want to fancy myself as connected in any way to Mr. Neal, I think there's this opportunity where you just sort of show up, and I had put posters up around the neighborhood, said, come learn how to make a video game. I really had no plan. And I met with these kids every week for 5 years. So over a long period of time, I got to watch learning happen up close and personal, right? And I got to see what happens when a child decides they want to learn something. It's really, really powerful. And I'd never seen anything like it. by sort of structuring the whole environment around that type of learning, I got very excited about, what would happen if we did this for more than just coding? What if we did it for English and math and science and social studies and everything else? And what would that take? And here again, it's starting with like the outcome, which we've come to call empowered learners, where you take a child who really chooses to learn, knows how to do it, like has the skills and attributes of a lifelong learner. And the question then became a format one. It's like, what's the best way to do that, right? I think a parent with their child can be great at that. I think a really gifted educator in a classroom of 30 in a very traditional school could be good at that, right? And so my question was, what would be the best way to bring this empowered learner concept to as many people as possible? And the insight there that we had was, and I found this out the hard way or the easy, whatever you want to call it. Like I started a microschool around my kitchen table. So I became this adult, completely unqualified, with 7 kids that were looking to me day in and day out to sort of help shepherd them through the learning process and create this opportunity. Well, in this mode, my realization was like, hey, I don't have the kind of credentials to do this, but I love these kids and I believe certain things about learning. And if I can sort of find other people out there that also love kids and believe those things about learning, then what can happen, right? And that's where my sort of scale entrepreneur brain kicked in, because it's like, there's something huge available here. We were doing it in my house, so you don't need to build buildings. We were doing it in a way that we figured out a way to do it for free to families, so that's not a barrier. We know there's adults in all these communities, and we've come to meet hundreds of them, like we talked about, that are ready to go, right? And they just need permission. They need tools and structures that will help them to be school, at least so that's the structure in and of itself isn't the part that I'm the most excited about. It's really is about what's happening for the learner. And what's cool is that happens for, a lot of the comments in the chat, I've been loving reading these, is about what happens to the adults who get to participate. I mean, this is a sacred trust. It's something special that we get to see. I never thought in my career in technology that I would care about my work, the level that I do now. And there's something really amazing about that. And I just, every day kind of pinch myself, like, this is real life, like real lives that are being changed, on a daily basis. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys all get that.
Yeah.
But that's the idea, right? Is let's bring that change to children. So instead of them thinking about their letter grade or their test score or feeling like they're dumb, it's like, hey, what about learning? Learning's amazing. You can do that.
Well, Kelly, I think every one of the 5 of us have chosen a path for ourselves, and we're just turning around and making that possible for the people that we serve or the children we serve. Gina,
Sure.
Jump in, please.
Yeah, no. And what we're really talking about here, right, is the power of intrinsic motivation, the power of intrinsic motivation in the learner. It's something I've been researching for 24 years, right? So everyone knows the power. Every teacher, every educator loves the power of intrinsic motivation. And it's hard to do in a traditional classroom structure. If you go back to research and you go back to self-determination theory, Edward Dietschy, Richard Ryan, for those of you who are not familiar, go read them. They're incredible. Right? They talk about the self-determination theory, where intrinsic motivation is facilitated using 3 things. And it's literally what I call the magic of teaching. It's the power of competence and the student knowing that they're competent in their environment, the power of autonomy and the student knowing that they have choice in their environment, and the power of relatedness, knowing that there are adults, whether it be teachers or facilitators or staff or parents, that care for them deeply, that will unconditionally love and accept them, whether they make mistakes or not. And we all know that mistakes are a huge part of learning, right? And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the power of intrinsic motivation through microschools. And that's why this movement is so great.
You know a panel's good when you've heard something you don't know and you have to stop yourself and write it down so you don't forget it. Gina, I'll be following up with you next week for that resource, or throw it into the chat for everybody, because it's like, oh, I need that. Excellent. Okay, so Steve, let's check. Anything coming through that we need to know about?
Lots of great comments. I don't think there are questions necessarily, but worth following. I am interested personally in the degree to which microschools open the door to people awakening to this sense of intrinsic motivation that both Kelly and Gina and Henry have been talking about. And to what degree are they already there and then choosing a microschool?
I think that you're onto something there, Steve. What do you guys think?
I mean, right, that's why people do it, right? I mean, I think so. From what I've been reading in chat, from what I've been hearing, that's why people do it.
I mean, the people that
But
I
we've
work with.
seen
Oh, go ahead,
we've
Steve.
seen 30 years plus, Henry, 100 years of really great kind of student-centered learning environments that have never scaled. Gina says we're at that moment, we're at the change moment. But at the same time, we've also seen lots of these really great endeavors kind of fade away and not really change the system as a whole. So we're talking about some way in which people shift their thinking about school. And do they come to the micro schools already having changed the thinking, or the word school is comforting to them, they like it, and then after a year they're like, wow, this is great?
I'd be interested to see, Henry, like, who's coming to Summerhill now? And are they coming, having already pulled their kids out or homeschooling their kids, or are their kids coming out of the system into Summerhill? Because that would be a good litmus test of that. And then Kelly, I'd love to hear you talk about, there's this new group of women of color in Arizona who've adopted your model and are really empowering this whole new generation of kids in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, we have always actually had a very, very broad range of different sort of families and people sending their kids to us. I think that I think it's always been quite a broad thing, and I'm not too sure. I'm just sort of thinking back. Sorry, I've just sort of jumped between questions a little bit because I was partly in where Steve was sort of talking about. Yeah. So I'm just sort of jumping, but maybe if you go to Kelly for a second, and then I can really dig on my thoughts. I've just sort of stumbled a bit there, so if you don't mind.
And apologies to you, because I know we're catching you quite late in the evening. So
we'll see. No problem at all.
So Kelly, who's coming to Prenda? And maybe you want to tell people a little bit about this. That one group I've read about in the press in particular is really interesting.
Yeah, and what's been amazing to me is that we've seen it in all types of communities. So we're doing work in indigenous populations, Native American reservations. We've seen a lot of rural folks, just people in smaller towns that have stepped up and said this is going to work really well. Suburban, inner city. You mentioned the Black Mothers Forum, which is a group of just really powerful moms who are like, hey, this isn't working. We've been complaining about it for a long time and not getting the results that we hope for in terms of, just being able to get change. And so let's do it ourselves. I mean, there's nothing more empowering than that, right? And so to say, to step up and say, let's do it. Now, here's what I think, getting back to Steve's question, I think is really interesting, is that most people aren't in that mode, right? I think because of this trend away from intrinsic motivation, this trend away from self-determination, you see entire adults now like expecting the world to just sort of be sort of neatly packaged up for them and handed to them. Like that's our expectation. And in part, that's because generationally that's happened. So you don't actually just find people that are like ideologically there or ready a lot, right? So we find a small number that are, and this is Prenda's model, is we find those people who get it already and they're excited. And we've done it with the state partnership model in 6 states. So we've seen this now in 6 different states. We're 6 for 6. We show up, we start talking about this. People come to us and they say yes to that. We are thinking that way too. I've been wanting to do this. And it's this pairing of like skills and resources, like put it together. It's really exciting to find because those people are amazing and they're out there and they're so motivated and energetic. But for every one of those, there's another, I don't want to get dramatic, but it's at least 100. It's probably in the thousands of people that like ideologically resonate. Like when you talk about it, they're like, yeah, it should be that. Like that makes sense. Why isn't it that, But they're not at the point where they're like, I'm going to do something drastic. Even if that something drastic is like pull my kid out of school and do something different. it's like they need work, they need it normalized, they need, and tipping point, I think was used earlier, Gina, was that you? It's like, we're getting closer and closer to that. I'm writing a book right now to sort of help get the word out. Like, hey, there's a different way to think about this, you guys. And of course, reading about Summerhill and reading about Montessori and reading, but there's a whole history of amazing, thought on this. Like, we're really trying to shake that out of people, that this whole thing is just, you're on some sort of like escalator ride, and all you can do is just stay like parameterized inside of this thing. And it's like wrong to talk, it's against the rules, all these things that are just like, it just doesn't make sense with what we know about success in life.
Yeah.
And so getting people, parents and others, out of that, it requires one person that'll do it, and then the other ones that are ready to follow.
Well, I'll tell you what we've found is that it can be difficult to find, we call them founding families. You guys probably call them something similar. It can be challenging to find founding families to launch your micro school. But consistently over and over again, the sort of characteristics of families who are ready for this, it follows that diffusion of innovation curve. So if you haven't seen that, go look that up. It's just that there are these early adopters, and they tend to be people who have tried something else already. So they've either homeschooled or unschooled, or they've put their kid in a charter school. A lot of times they'll do that, or they've tried a private school. Maybe it's too expensive. It's not a good fit. And so they've tried something, and they're continuing to look for a better fit. And oftentimes the parents are entrepreneurs. Because I think that goes to a parent who's actually built their own pathway as a business person, has had to create their own pathway, has used inquiry learning themselves throughout a lifetime of becoming an entrepreneur. And it's that propensity. And when you've done that for yourself, it's really easy to turn around and want that for your kid. So those are the criteria, or those are the characteristics I've seen of parents who are willing to jump into this kind of an endeavor with their kid.
Yeah. That's really brave though, right? Because you're letting go of existing structures. And I think, the tipping point is when we let go of existing structures and look for alternatives, but it's still a really brave, courageous choice. And for those of you who are building microschools, like, what a brave, courageous choice. And for Henry to have Summerhill after 100 years, like, what a brave, courageous choice. And for Kelly, right, to have, like, what a brave, courageous choice. And people have to be honored for that.
So we're coming up. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to do the same exact thing. I think we need to make sure this is a very small scale endeavor. So we're going to host the next set of rooms. So if we could have at least 3 or 4 minutes to make the transition, that would be great. There was a really good question.
Can I ask them one wrapping up question?
You can do whatever you'd like, but I don't want us to miss Carissa's question about credentialed teachers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What do you guys think? Do teachers have to be credentialed to be operating or facilitating learning in a micro school? I'm thinking this is a question that's going to come up in the near future in terms of what state departments of education have to say about the whole movement.
I can say that I have amazing teachers that are also looking for alternatives. Amazing credentialized teachers who are also looking for different things. And so that's a good thing. That being said, I don't know if, everyone needs to be credentialized to be a good teacher, because what we're really talking about is facilitation of learning, which is a little bit different from teaching per se.
Just talking a bit from Summerhill's perspective, we don't actually have, we don't have to have teachers who actually have qualifications to be teaching at Summerhill. And it's a very important thing for us that that's the case, actually. But it is, I guess, that having experience is having a situation where the adult actually kind of has experience with working with subjects and knowing about the different, especially sort of different areas of working with different children and moving with their levels and bits and pieces with things like that is something that's very valuable. But we don't specifically have any requirements from that perspective. And actually we don't require, when we're looking for new teachers, we don't require it at all, actually.
Kelly, how about you? Do you have to have teachers credentialed in order to facilitate your microschools?
No, in fact, we've deliberately created the role. We've called it learning guides. In part, the word guide is to reinforce that you're not trying to do something to someone against their will. And that's there's maybe like a subtle thing there. We have a lot of people with teaching credentials that come our way for those same reasons Gina just talked about. And we find that there's folks with that background that are amazing. We find a lot of paraprofessionals, others who have spent a lot of time on campuses with kids, who love kids, and they're capable of, they're gifted really at inspiring learning and being there for the kids. I think there was a time and place where it was about having the information yourself and transmitting that information effectively. And we live in a world now where information exists and it's more about going out and getting it. So the role changes, right? And we think that teaching, learning science and pedagogy, we actually hire a lot of those people that are experts at this, advanced degrees, lots of time and effort spent on this. They're helping us design systems and supports. The person that's there in person with the kids, and the most important thing for that person is, can you love these kids? Can you be there for them? Can you create an environment where kids feel safe to do take the risks and make the mistakes and learn, right? And really become a learner.
Yeah, I have seen over and over again, the biggest barrier when a teacher has credentials is overcoming that need to teach, to do direct instruction. But there are plenty of people who can do that, and plenty of people who accomplish that. So Steve, what's up next? You want to let everybody know where we're going from here?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. This is so fun. I'm so appreciative, Gina and Henry and Kelly, of your being here and participating. Next up, we've got Tasha Ring and Katie Broadbent, also from Prenda, and Henry doing their own sessions, telling the stories of starting their schools. Following that, Michael Strong and Amy, how do you say Amy's last name, Mara?
Maratz.
Amy Maratz. And those are their 45-minute blocks each. And then Mara and I are going to come back at the end and kind of drill down on this between the two of us, following probably some of the same conversations we've had here, and really asking sort of the penetrating questions about where are we going from here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're going to
don't worry if you can't watch you can't watch 3 sessions at once. They're all being recorded. So pick the one that lights you up, and know that you can see the other 2 to 3 that you're going to miss. Okay, we'll see you.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Gina.
Thank you, guys.
And for those who are interested, we will post the chat.
So will you put me into my group, or do I go to the link that you sent me?
Yeah, Henry, go to the link for your room, which is learning zoom.us/my/learning3.
Learning 3. Yeah, I'll find. I've got the email you sent me. So
perfect.
I'll do that now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.